We were never supposed to go back. That was the warning. And yet, here we are, decades later, staring at the grainy footage, listening to the crackling voices of men who stepped where they never should have. In 1990, a classified transmission was leaked, one that NASA quickly dismissed as a hoax. But those who heard it, those who really listened, knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the static or the panicked breathing. It was what came after. The silence, the dead air, and the final chilling words before everything cut out. They know we're here. We grew up believing the moon was just a rock floating in the cold void, lifeless and barren, a place humanity had conquered. But what if we were wrong? What if we weren't the first ones there? Or worse, what if we were never alone to begin with? Dr. Alan Carter was one of the last men to work on a lunar mission before it was abruptly shut down. He never spoke about it, not in interviews, not even to his family. But on his deathbed, he whispered something to his son, a single phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Stay away from the moon. No one knew why NASA suddenly abandoned all plans for further exploration, why funding for moon missions mysteriously vanished overnight. But those who worked behind the scenes, the engineers, the astronauts, the radio operators, they knew. And now, after decades of silence, the truth is beginning to surface. A group of independent researchers recently uncovered old mission logs, hidden, buried deep within government archives. What they found shouldn't exist. Mission transcripts that were never declassified, distorted images showing something, figures that shouldn't be there, shadows that moved when no one was walking. And worst of all, an audio file with voices that didn't belong to the crew. NASA dismissed the evidence. They called it lens flares, audio glitches, misinterpretations. But those who dug deeper, who connected the pieces, realized there was a pattern. Every mission after Apollo 17 was quietly shut down. Every attempt to return was denied. And the few astronauts who spoke out, they disappeared. Some claimed they left the public eye by choice. Others weren't so lucky. Now a new team is preparing for a return mission. Technology has advanced. The public is demanding answers. But if history has taught us anything, it's that some warnings should never be ignored. Because the last time we went to the moon, we weren't alone. And if we go back, we might not come home. And then there's the final transmission. The one they never released. The one that wasn't meant to be heard. It started with a whisper, a voice barely audible over the interference. It's watching us. A pause. Then the sound of heavy breathing, frantic murmurs, a scream, and finally a single phrase before everything went silent. Don't come back. The records were either erased or buried so deep within classified archives that no one would ever uncover them. But I was there, and I remember every detail. It began with a man known only as Commander Hayes. He wasn't the type you'd expect to command an operation of this magnitude. Quiet, unassuming, yet possessing a razor-sharp wit and an even stronger sense of duty. He had once served in the Royal Air Force, but his file was conspicuously blank regarding his later years. That's because his final mission never officially happened. If you asked about him now, you'd receive nothing but polite smiles and vague answers, as if he had never existed at all. Hayes wasn't alone. There was a team, though I can't reveal all their names. Some changed identities after the mission. Some vanished entirely, and some never made it back. But one name is etched into my memory, Dr. Eleanor Price, a scientist of extraordinary brilliance, her intellect sharper than any scalpel. She had dedicated her life to understanding the effects of deep space travel on the human body, convinced that humanity had barely scratched the surface of the unknown. But this mission was never about exploration. It was about something far more sinister. The Soviets possessed technology beyond our comprehension. That much was undeniable. The Americans had won the race to the moon, but whispers persisted that the Soviets had found something hidden. Strange transmissions had been intercepted from the moon's dark side, signals that didn't correspond to anything made by human hands. The Soviets had spent years investigating them, but with the USSR collapsing, their projects were in turmoil. And so, in the shadows, a desperate agreement was forged, an uneasy alliance between British intelligence and a handful of Soviet scientists who refused to let their life's work be swallowed by the ruins of a dying empire. That's how we ended up there, in a launch facility somewhere deep in Siberia, under a sky so wide it felt like it could swallow you whole. The rocket was a modified Soviet design, crude but effective. There were no press conferences, no broadcasts, no celebrations. Just a handful of people who knew the truth and a countdown whispered into the freezing air. The journey itself was uneventful, at least at first. But space has a way of changing people. There's a moment, just after you leave the atmosphere, when you realize how small and fragile you are. It's humbling, it's terrifying, and for some, it's unbearable. One of the crew, a man whose name I will never say, started whispering to himself as soon as we lost sight of Earth. By the time we reached lunar orbit, he was convinced we weren't alone. And maybe he was right. There are things you can explain and things you can't. The things I saw on that mission belong in the second category. We landed near the southern pole of the moon, far from the American sites. The Soviets had chosen this location for a reason. They had been tracking something that moved. Officially, the moon is lifeless. Unofficially? I'm not so sure. Dr. Price was the first to step out. Her voice crackled through the radio, excitement barely contained. But then there was silence, a long, dreadful silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different, shaken. "There's something here," she whispered. I followed her gaze and saw them. Footprints. Not ours, not American, not Soviet, something else. They led away from the lander, deeper into the darkness. We should have left. We should have reported our findings and gone home. But we didn't. Curiosity, pride, duty, whatever it was, it pushed us forward. We followed the trail, each step filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. And then we saw it. A structure. Not natural. Not human. Something ancient, buried beneath layers of lunar dust, partially exposed as if waiting for us to find it. The entrance was a simple archway, carved into the rock, leading into the abyss. "This isn't possible," Hayes muttered. But it was. And it was real. I won't tell you what we found inside. Not yet. Some truths are too dangerous to share. But I will say this. When we came back, we weren't the same. Some of us never truly returned at all. The mission was buried, our names erased, our experiences dismissed as fantasy. But I remember, and now so do you. The men repeated several times, Operation Emberfall. It was the first time I'd heard it, and even though I didn't understand its significance, I knew instinctively that it was something deeply classified. The men spoke in hushed but hurried voices, as if time itself was slipping through their fingers. I caught snippets, references to intercepted communications, a failed containment, an unexpected variable. But no one explained why I was there. After what felt like an eternity, one of them, a thin man with sharp eyes and a deep scar running down his jawline, finally turned to me. He asked if I understood what I was being asked to do. I said no. He smirked, exchanged a glance with a heavy-set man to his right, and then slid a single file across the table toward me. Inside were photographs, blurry satellite images, some of people, others of locations that looked abandoned, and one that made my stomach twist. A laboratory? The kind you only see in espionage thrillers. "You were chosen," the thin man said, "because you're good at keeping secrets." I wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment or a threat. I flipped through the file, my pulse quickening. There was a name scrawled on the top page, one I didn't recognize. But below it, in the corner, was something more alarming. My own name, typed neatly, as if I had already been woven into whatever dark web they were spinning. "You don't have a choice in this," the heavy-set man added, as if reading my hesitation. "You're already involved." That was when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Coming along without question had been an act of blind curiosity, a moment of naive compliance. Now I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to walk away. In the weeks that followed, I was given a new identity, new credentials, and an assignment that made less sense the more I learned. I was to travel under the guise of an academic consultant, meet a contact whose name was never spoken outright, and retrieve something. A device, a formula, a person? They never specified. But the deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about espionage in the traditional sense. There were factions, splinter groups within their own government, rogue scientists working on things they shouldn't have been. And something else, something they were desperate to keep buried. By the time I arrived at my destination, I was already being watched. I felt it in the way people hesitated when they passed me, in the way my hotel phone rang, but no one spoke when I answered. My contact never showed. Instead, a different man found me. A man who wasn't supposed to exist, according to the files I had been given. He slid into the seat across from me at a dimly lit cafe and leaned forward just enough for me to see the faint burn scars on his knuckles. "You don't know what you're part of," he whispered, "but I can help you get out." I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't sure if I could. Because somewhere, buried in the classified reports I had been forced to memorize, there was a single undeniable truth. Everyone who tried to leave had disappeared. Irregularities that immediately sent a chill down my spine. In the center of the frame, partially buried in the lunar dust, was what looked like a human figure. The grainy quality of the photo made it hard to distinguish details, but the shape was unmistakable. A spacesuit, crumpled and still, like it had been discarded. I flipped to the next image, my hands shaking slightly. This one was closer, zoomed in on the figure. The helmet visor reflected something behind the camera, something dark and jagged, like a shadow with no clear source. I swallowed hard. The Apollo 17 crew had all returned home. There was no official record of anyone left behind. And yet, this was a person. I looked up at the older man. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes bore into me, waiting for a reaction. This isn't possible," I murmured. His lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in it. "Possible?" he repeated. "We have known about this for years, and yet we do not know who." He stopped himself, inhaling sharply. "Or what it is." A flicker of unease ran through the group. One of the other men, a younger officer with a sharp jawline, exhaled through his nose and leaned forward. "Turn the page," he instructed. I hesitated, then did as I was told. The third photo was worse. The suit was more visible now. The name tag was partially obscured by dust, but I could make out some letters. CERN, the rest unreadable. The visor cracked, and through the crack, a hint of something wrong. The fourth image made my stomach drop. The visor was fully shattered now, as if something had broken through from the inside. There was no face behind the glass, just darkness where a human presence should have been. A hollow, gaping void. Silence filled the room. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then, the older man spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "We received these photographs from an unmanned lunar probe in 1983. It was meant to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Instead, it returned with this." He tapped the photos. The probe was lost shortly after. No explanation. I looked around the table. Nobody spoke. The weight of whatever they weren't telling me pressed down on my chest. "What do you want me to do?" My own voice sounded distant. The older man finally smiled, but it was a cold, knowing expression. "You're going back, either dead or sworn to secrecy. The Soviet Union couldn't afford the humiliation of a failed mission, so we buried it. No one would ever know. At least, that's what we believed. But then, in 1974, a weak distress signal was picked up by one of our satellites. It was an old Soviet frequency, one that should have gone silent with the lost crew. The signal was faint, almost decayed, as if it had been bouncing through space for years before reaching us. At first, we thought it was an error, some stray interference. But when we decoded it, the message was chilling. One word over and over, alive. There was no way. No food, no water, no oxygen. They were dead. They had to be dead. And yet the transmission continued, repeating at irregular intervals for months, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, as if whoever or whatever was sending it was moving. By 1976, we had another problem. The Americans. They had picked up something too. A classified report from an intelligence asset within NASA suggested that Apollo 17 had unknowingly captured images of something that shouldn't have been there. The Soviets weren't the only ones keeping secrets. Krantsov sighed, rubbing his temples. We sent a second team, smaller, better prepared. This time, they weren't just cosmonauts. They were specialists. His voice faltered. The British man leaned forward, unimpressed. And what did they find? Krantsov hesitated, then reached for another folder. They didn't report back, but their landing module was found, empty. He slid a grainy, time-worn photograph across the table. It showed the second lunar lander, hatch open, tether lines cut. But the real horror was in the background. Beyond the lander, faint in the darkness, were footprints. Human footprints, leading away. But there were too many. Far too many. Dead or too old to care. But in 1974, something changed. We intercepted a strange transmission, weak and distorted, but unmistakably human. At first, we thought it was an echo from one of our old satellites, but as we cleaned up the audio, the message became clear. It was in Russian. Help! Still here, not alone. It made no sense. Our cosmonauts had perished in '68, their mission buried under layers of secrecy. But if that was true, then who was sending this message? The Soviet government was rattled. They launched a secret probe, Luna 26, to survey the old landing site. It returned only one image before shutting down, a single blurred frame of something moving near the wreckage of our lander. Krantzoven paused, his hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. "We were warned," he muttered, "by them." The British man scoffed. "Who the hell are they?" Krantzoven glanced around, lowering his voice. Apollo 17 reported seeing strange lights on the lunar horizon, didn't they? They weren't hallucinating. He slid another image across the table. It showed the remnants of a Soviet spacesuit, but something was off. The suit looked filled, as if something was still inside, standing upright. The visor was shattered, and within the darkness of the helmet, faint glowing eyes peered back. "They never left," he whispered, "and neither did we." Silence suffocated the room. Then, the radio on the table crackled. A voice barely above a whisper came through in Russian. "Help! Still here, not alone." It was the same transmission from 1974, but this time it wasn't coming from deep space. It was coming from inside the building. Stiffened in his chair, glancing at the others before speaking. "You were assigned to this because of your work in image analysis. We need you to verify something. Something we can't risk letting out unless we're absolutely sure." I hesitated, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. "Verify what exactly?" The older man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We've recovered more footage that was never meant to be seen." He slid a thick folder across the table. My fingers twitched as I hesitated to open it. "What you're about to see, it's not just another blurry photo or radio interference. It's something none of us can explain." With a deep breath, I flipped the folder open. The first image was grainy but unmistakable. The outline of the shadowy figure was clearer now, its elongated form stretching unnaturally across the lunar surface. It stood between the astronaut and the module, impossibly tall, its featureless face locked in a permanent, predatory stare. I turned the page, my breath hitching. The next sequence of images showed something worse, something impossible. The figure had moved. It was closer. This isn't just a trick of the light," I whispered. The older man nodded. "No, and there's more." He reached for a remote, pressing a button that activated a small monitor in the center of the table. The screen flickered to life with a video feed, footage from the Apollo 17 mission, but it wasn't the kind they showed to the public. The camera was shaky, the image distorted, but the voices were clear. "Commander, do you see that?" one of the astronauts whispered. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" Another voice, breathless. The feed jumped, and suddenly there was static, long, crackling silence. Then, a scream. I jerked back in my seat as the video cut out abruptly. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the projector cooling down. My pulse was hammering. "What happened next?" I demanded. The older man didn't answer right away. Instead, he exchanged a look with the others before sighing heavily. "We don't know. The next recording was corrupted, and by the time we re-established communication, they were already on their way back." I swallowed hard. "And when they returned, they weren't the same." He nodded. "Not even close." A heavy silence filled the room. The implications were clear. Something had been up there with them. Something real. And whatever it was, it had left its mark in ways they never recovered from. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my mind racing. "So, what do you want me to do?" The older man studied me carefully. "We need you to find out if it's still out there." The documents away in my desk drawer, convinced that this was the last I'd hear of it. But as the days passed, a strange unease settled over me. It wasn't just the absurdity of their request. It was the way they had looked at me, like they knew something I didn't, like they expected me to change my mind. Then the calls started. At first, they were polite. Reminders, check-ins, a soft push to reconsider. I ignored them, but then they became persistent. Numbers I didn't recognize. Calls in the middle of the night. No one spoke on the other end, just silence, deep and unbroken, like someone was listening. I tried to shake it off, to focus on my lectures and research, but I started noticing things. A car parked too long across the street from my flat. A shadow disappearing around a corner just as I turned. My apartment door slightly ajar when I was certain I had locked it. Then, one night, I woke up to find the documents spread out on my desk. I hadn't touched them since the day I stuffed them away, yet there they were, neatly arranged, the top page flipped open to a section I hadn't read before. Crew Recovery Report. I skimmed over the official jargon until my eyes landed on the last recorded transmission from the mission. We are not alone. The words sent a chill through me, but it was the second message, the one transmitted hours later, that made my breath catch. It's inside. I slammed the folder shut and stood abruptly, my heart pounding. This was ridiculous. A psychological test, maybe? Some elaborate ploy to see if I'd break? I was done with this. I grabbed my coat, ready to storm out, but as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed. A new message. You need to listen. A file was attached, an audio recording. Hesitant, I played it, static at first. Then a voice, strained, desperate, barely human. Doctor, you have to. A sharp screech cut through the words. And then something else. A sound that didn't belong to this world will do to us. We are not prepared for a battle of this kind. The mind is fragile, comrade, and they know it. They know exactly how to break us in ways we can't even begin to understand. I could feel my pulse quickening as Kratsov spoke. His hands were trembling slightly, his usually sharp and unwavering voice now carrying the weight of something deeply unsettling. The others in the room exchanged glances, their faces pale under the dim cellar light. The silence that followed his words was thick, suffocating. What happened to the team? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Kratsov hesitated. We don't know. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean you don't know? The feed cut out. One moment, they were there, scrambling to get back into the module. The next, nothing, just static. We sent a distress signal, no response. We tried to regain visual contact. Nothing. I swallowed hard. And the module? Gone. I could barely breathe. The very idea of a spacecraft simply vanishing without a trace, no debris, no distress signals, no bodies, was impossible. They didn't just disappear, did they? I said slowly. Something took them. Kratsov looked at me, his expression grim. That's what we fear. And if we're right, then we were never meant to leave Earth. A tense hush fell over the room. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. We had always believed space was vast, empty, waiting to be explored. But now, it seemed we had stumbled into something that had been watching, waiting, and we had ignored the warnings. Then, the lights flickered. A soft humming noise filled the air, low, pulsing, unnatural. The others stiffened, eyes darting around the room. Kratsov's face went pale. They're already here, he whispered. I had almost managed to convince myself that my past was just that, the past. But when I saw Kratsov again, standing at the entrance of the hospital lobby, I knew that assumption had been naive. He was older now, with deep lines carving into his face, but his posture was as rigid as ever. He didn't acknowledge me at first. He merely stood there, watching me from across the lobby, his presence alone making my heart pound. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hand and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn around, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But I knew that wasn't an option. Not with Kratsov. We walked in silence down the sterile hallway, my mind racing with possibilities. When we finally stopped in front of an unmarked door, he turned to me and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. You need to see something. The room was dimly lit, with a single monitor flickering in the corner. On the screen was a grainy video feed. The timestamp read December 25th, 1990. My stomach clenched. The footage showed the inside of the lunar module just minutes before the catastrophic event. The astronauts were seated, their movements calm as they carried out final checks. Then, at precisely 3:47 a.m., a shadow appeared in the corner of the screen. It moved unnaturally, shifting and elongating like it was defying the laws of physics. The men on board reacted almost instantly, their expressions contorting from confusion to pure terror. One of them reached for the emergency controls, but before his fingers could make contact, the screen distorted into a mess of static and black shapes. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feed cut out. Kratsov let the silence stretch between us before finally speaking. We found this 2 weeks ago, hidden in an archive that should have been destroyed with the rest of the mission records. I tore my gaze away from the monitor, searching his face for answers. Why show me this now? My voice came out harsher than I intended. Because, he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, battered notebook, they sent another mission last year, and we never heard back. A cold wave of realization washed over me. The warnings from 1990 had been clear. Stay away from the moon, yet someone had ignored them. Before I could ask another question, Kratzoff placed the notebook in my hands. It was labeled with a single word, handwritten in shaking letters. Survivor. I looked back up at him, but his expression was unreadable. Whatever is up there, he said, it's waiting, and we may have already woken it up. Kratzoff took a slow sip of his brandy, his sharp eyes studying me over the rim of his glass. Let's just say, he began, exhaling a thick cloud of cigar smoke, old habits die hard. Even without a uniform, I still have responsibilities. His tone was light, almost amused, but something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Responsibilities? I repeated, narrowing my eyes. He leaned in slightly. You know, doctor, psychology isn't so different from intelligence work. Both require understanding the human mind, predicting behavior, and sometimes influencing outcomes. A cold realization crept over me. This wasn't just a chance meeting. He was here for something, or someone. Kratzoff, what are you really doing here? I asked, lowering my voice. He let out a small chuckle. Have you heard about the incident at Broadmoor last month? A patient disappeared. I froze. Broadmoor was a fortress. Nobody just disappeared from there. I know what you're thinking, he continued, but it wasn't an escape. There was no breach, no missing footage, no signs of forced entry. One day, the patient was there. The next, gone. And here's where it gets interesting. The last person they spoke to before vanishing was you. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. You haven't seen them? Or you don't remember seeing them? His eyes glinted with something unreadable. I started replaying every session, every face I had encountered in Broadmoor. I had worked with some of the most disturbed minds imaginable, but none of them should have had the means or the connections to vanish without a trace. You've been involved in more than you realize, Kratzoff murmured. And now, there are people who want to know what you know. A creeping unease settled in my chest. Who? Kratzoff crushed his cigar in the ashtray and gave me a knowing smile. Let's just say they don't care if you remember or not. They want answers, and they won't ask nicely. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just a missing patient. This was something much, much bigger. He leaned back in his chair, the amber glow of the bar lights flickering in his glass. At first, it worked like a charm, he continued, his voice dropping just enough to make me lean in. But then, as you might expect, certain people started noticing the flow of gold. A few calls were made. A few hands were shaken. And suddenly, I was no longer just a businessman. I was a liability. I watched his expression shift, the amusement in his eyes fading into something darker. One evening, I got a call. A friend of mine, an old contact in Moscow, warned me that my name had been brought up in a meeting I was never supposed to be part of. They had started asking questions about where all the gold had gone. Questions that, if answered truthfully, would make my continued existence inconvenient. He swirled the brandy in his glass before setting it down with deliberate care. So I did what any smart man would do. I disappeared. Changed my name, my face, my affiliations. But there was one loose end I couldn't quite tie up. He met my gaze. You. A chill ran down my spine. Me? What do I have to do with any of this? He smiled, but there was no humor in it. You were there at the beginning, weren't you? When I first started making deals, you knew things, even if you didn't realize their importance at the time. And if I found you, it means someone else could too. Maybe they already have. A sudden rush of paranoia hit me. I glanced around the dimly lit bar, suddenly aware of every shadowed corner, every unassuming patron who could be listening. Are you saying I'm in danger? He let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. I'm saying that if I were you, I'd start watching my back, because if they're still looking for me, it won't be long before they start looking for you too. I leaned forward, watching the flickering light of the television reflect off Kratz's face. His expression had darkened, his jovial demeanor slipping away like a mask removed after a long night. We should have never sent them, he muttered, almost to himself. It was doomed before it began. A cold weight settled in my chest. Who? The cosmonauts? Kratz exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Not just them. It wasn't an ordinary mission. What the world believes is that the 1990 lunar attempt was a failure. Engines malfunctioned, telemetry was lost, and the craft drifted into the void. But that's a lie. It reached its destination. My fingers curled into the arms of my chair. Then why cover it up? He looked me dead in the eye. Because they found something, and they weren't supposed to. A shiver ran down my spine. Kratz, a man who had laughed in the face of military corruption and sold stolen tanks without fear, was visibly disturbed. Found what? I asked, voice hushed. He hesitated before continuing. There was a signal, anomalous, unnatural. The cosmonauts reported strange readings as they approached lunar orbit, but command dismissed it as interference. When they landed, they transmitted one final message before all contact was lost. I swallowed. What did they say? He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. They said they weren't alone. The words lingered in the air between us, thick with an unspoken dread. You're saying something was there? Kratz gave a hollow laugh. Not was, is, and that's why no one ever went back. A sharp knock at the hotel door shattered the silence. We both froze. The knock came again, measured, deliberate. Kratz's face drained of color. You didn't tell anyone we were talking, did you? I shook my head. He stood, motioning for silence. The third knock came, more forceful this time. He exhaled through gritted teeth. They know we're talking. Forward, lowering his voice as if someone might be listening. They asked for something in return, comrade, and we gave it to them. A cold weight settled in my stomach. What was it? I asked, already dreading the answer. People, Kratzov said, simply swirling his drink. Not many at first. Prisoners, those who would never be missed. The unwanted. But as time went on, they asked for more. Scientists, engineers, entire families. I felt my throat go dry. You traded them for technology? We didn't understand at first, he continued. We assumed they needed test subjects. Biology was never their strong suit. But then our agents in the West discovered something disturbing. The Americans were giving them people too. And yet, neither side knew exactly what happened to them after the exchange. They vanished. A chill ran through me. Did anyone try to find out? Kratzov exhaled sharply, a humorless laugh. Of course, but those who dug too deep either disappeared themselves or returned. Different. A few managed to send messages before vanishing again. They spoke of something beyond comprehension, something that warped reality itself. We assumed they were mad, until we received something from Nama. He reached into his jacket and slid a small, yellowed photograph onto the table. My breath caught. It was grainy and distorted, but unmistakable. A group of Soviet officers stood in what looked like a featureless black void, their faces frozen in horror. Behind them, barely visible, was something wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away. What is that? Kratzov leaned in. We don't know. But whatever it is, comrade, it isn't from our world. And it's watching us. Always. The air felt heavy, suffocating. So the mission in '68 was to stop them? He nodded. We tried, and now we're running out of time. A distant sound echoed through the room. Faint, mechanical, deliberate. My pulse quickened. Kratzov's expression darkened. They know we're talking. Tool, and they know that people are moving away from it. That's why they're taking a different approach now. One that doesn't require faith, just trust. I frowned. Trust in what? Kratzov sighed and stopped pacing. In what they show you, in what they make you feel. They don't need to create a god anymore. They can create reality itself. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? They've perfected the experiments, comrade. They can alter perception itself. Not through chemicals or implants, but through subtle, precise changes in how the human brain interprets reality. They can make you see things that aren't there, hear voices that never spoke, remember events that never happened. And now they want to implement it on a global scale. My stomach turned. You mean mass hallucinations? He nodded grimly. More than that, mass rewriting of reality. A world where people will no longer be able to tell what's real and what's not. They could change history overnight, erase entire figures from existence, create new ones. And the worst part? No one would question it, because to them, it would be the only truth they know. I swallowed hard. And you're telling me this because? Gratzov hesitated. Then, for the first time, he looked scared. Because I need to know if it's already happening. The room felt colder. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. What do you mean? I whispered. He leaned in, his voice barely above a breath. I've been having memories, comrade. Memories of a past that doesn't exist. Names, faces, entire conversations. None of them real. But they feel real. I remember people who, according to every record, never existed. And the worst part? He shuddered. I think they're doing the same to you. My mouth went dry. That's impossible, I muttered, but even as I said it, doubt crept in. Hadn't I felt it too? Strange moments where things seemed off, little gaps in my past that I'd brushed off as forgetfulness. Gratzov reached into his pocket and pulled out an old yellowed photograph. He handed it to me. Tell me, comrade, do you recognize this man? I took it hesitantly. The moment my eyes landed on the face, I felt a wave of familiarity. My chest tightened. I knew him. I remembered him. But I didn't know why. And worse, I had no proof he had ever existed. As I sat in my hotel room later that night, the weight of Kratzov's words settled in. The idea that something so vast and insidious could be unfolding without the world's knowledge was terrifying. If what he said was true, then we were on the precipice of something unimaginable. The idea that an experiment, one set into motion centuries ago, could still be shaping the world was difficult to grasp. I replayed our conversation in my head, trying to piece together what it all meant. The warning about anti-prophets, the time frame, the cryptic nature of the experiment, none of it gave me comfort. I had spent years chasing stories, unraveling hidden truths, but this was different. This was something that reached beyond human conflicts, something that suggested an unseen hand had been at work far longer than we had ever realized. But what could I do with this knowledge? If I tried to share it, I would be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. If I pursued it further, I could be putting myself in danger. The thought gnawed at me as I scrolled through the photos I had taken of Kratzov. His face, lined with years of experience, held a quiet seriousness that now seemed even more profound. I had promised to send him the photos, but I had no way of reaching him. A few months passed, and life moved on. I went back to my usual assignments, covering stories that felt mundane in comparison. Yet, in quiet moments, my mind drifted back to that conversation. I started noticing patterns in global events, little shifts that seemed inconsequential, but when viewed through Kratzov's lens, hinted at something larger. Divisions deepening, ideologies becoming more extreme. Was it all just natural human conflict, or was something else pushing us toward chaos? I kept the photos of Kratzov as a reminder, though I never saw him again. There was no way to track him down, and in time, I convinced myself that perhaps it had all been a strange, fascinating conversation with no real consequences. But a part of me never truly believed that. Years later, in the early 2000s, I saw a brief news article about a man named Kratzov, found dead under mysterious circumstances in Moscow. There were no details, no investigation, just a quiet footnote in an international news bulletin. I didn't know for certain if it was him, but deep down, I felt it was. A cold realization settled over me. He had known too much. Or perhaps he had simply reached the end of a path that was always meant to be erased. I never pursued the story further. Not out of fear, but because I understood that some truths were never meant to be uncovered. The world moved on, as it always did, oblivious to the forces that shaped it from the shadows. I often wondered if Kratzov's warning had come true, if the world had already fallen into the hands of those he had feared. But if that were the case, would we even recognize it? One day, I found myself looking through my old belongings, and I came across the photos I had taken that night. Kratzov's face stared back at me, frozen in time, a silent reminder of a story I would never tell. I put the photos away, knowing that the answers would always remain just out of reach. Some stories don't need an ending. They just continue, unseen, shaping the world in ways we may never understand.